Welcome to Unstitching ADHD Urban Ed Talks. I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Akiyo. I couldn't be more thrilled to introduce you to today's guest. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Steve Lysenko. Our esteemed guest brings a unique perspective to our discussion today. As a devoted parent of a child with ADHD and a seasoned educator, he infuses his classroom and school building with passion and expertise. Dr. Lysenko, we are honored to have you in our podcast today.
Dr. Ekior, thank you for your kind words, and it's always a pleasure to be joining you, my friend. So a little bit about myself. As Dr. Ekior said, I am an educator with nearly 24 years of experience, all in public education in the greater Rochester area, 14 of which have been as an educational leader in suburban districts. The vast majority of my teaching and administrative experience has been at the 6 through 12 juncture, the secondary juncture. Currently, I am a science teacher at a middle school in the Rochester City School District. I am also an adjunct professor at St. John Fisher University's Ralph C. Wilson's Junior School of Education. This past August, in 2023, I received my doctorate in executive leadership from St. John Fisher University. My dissertation examined the implementation of the New York State Education Department's culturally responsive sustaining education framework by high school leaders in predominantly white schools and districts. On a personal note, I am the proud father and stepfather of 5 grown children, 2 of whom have a diagnosis of ADD and ADHD. My wife Jennifer and I are both lifelong residents of the greater Rochester area, and we're happy to welcome our first grandchild to the world just a month ago today, Lori May. So that's a little bit about me.
Congratulations. That's great. And
Thank
we're
you.
very happy to hear that. Could you share your experience raising children with ADHD?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So one of the things that is striking to me is that I find that I find that in society, oh, it's just my ADD, it's my ADHD acting up again. That gets thrown around so much that in some ways, I think it's cheapened that diagnosis. So I think, research shows that ADD, ADHD is the most overdiagnosed medical diagnosis, and it is a medical and psychiatric condition. So as an educator, I know that. And as a parent, I know that too. So that's something that I always kept in the back of my mind. I think if anything, looking back on my experience with Max and Maddie, my now 18-year-old son and 22-year-old daughter, I think I was hesitant to advocate for them to get a label. And by a label, I mean either an IEP or a 504 plan, because what I wanted to see is what could they do without special education supports on their own? How could they become and grow their own self-efficacy and become great self-advocates? And it was a good discussion with their mother. It was kind of an interesting situation. Their mother and I separated and divorced when Maddie was in her early teens and Max was in his preteen years. So that's a dynamic too. We always agreed, even though we got divorced, we always agreed to work together to support our children in the best way possible. Both of Maddie and Max's parents. So I am an educator, and their mother, Kelly, is also an educator, a special education teacher. So we both knew the ins and outs of the systems, and at the same time also wanted our children to be seen as this is Max and this is Maddie, and not just have a label attached to them. But all that being said, Max and Maddie were 2 very different children from one another, and ADHD and ADD presented themselves very differently. I would say that both were first diagnosed with anxiety, and they also exhibited what we would call ADHD or ADD behaviors. Like, Max would lose his head if it weren't attached to his neck. So for Max, it was the typical executive function kind of organization and self management of time, especially those were the two big areas. And also, he had some impulsivity issues. He was uh, always very athletic, but not only athletic, I would say exhibited some impulsivity. For example, in sixth grade, I got a call from one of my friends because both my children went to Spry Middle School, which is where I started my teaching career, and I still have friends there. I get a call from my friend who was the phys ed teacher and say, Steve, I never thought I'd be making this phone call, but I literally saw your son climb a wall today. I said, what?
Mm.
So Max literally climbed the wall of the gymnasium and got into the underpinnings of the basketball hoop and had climbed up the backboard and was sitting on the top of the backboard. All of this in about 20 seconds times that the teacher had gone from the gym back into the locker room, the changing room, and came back out all in 20 seconds. Like, boom, not much thought went into that. And so, you know, one of the things we talked about is, okay, yes, there's this internal drive and impulsivity, but at the same time, Max, we got to take responsibility for our actions too. And, he said, yeah, you're right. I should not have climbed the wall, nor should I be, that wasn't safe. And thank God I didn't get hurt. Yes, you're right. And you're grounded. And so it's that idea of keeping in mind that this is both a child that has ADD, ADHD, but at the same time, I want him to be a healthy, happy, and safe adult and young adult and child and make good choices. My wife, his mother, and I both, that was key. That's key in our conversations and working with both of our children. With Maddie, again, she was diagnosed first with anxiety, but then she noticed, she's a very introspective young lady and is now a very successful environmental chemistry major who's set to graduate from ESF, the
Well,
Environmental Science and Forestry School in Syracuse next month. Proud papa I am, and is doing wonderfully. But she noticed in her later years in high school, it became more and more challenging for her to maintain focus and to maintain time on task for any extended period of time. And she would find that her mind wandered. She would have distracting thoughts, and this would feed her anxiety because she wasn't getting her work done. And it
mhm.
just was kind of a very vicious cycle. So, what's interesting is Max ultimately chose he attempted a medical trial or a medicine trial, and he found that he didn't like that. And he was not a big fan of the typical ADD, ADHD medications. So we're like, all right, if you don't want to use that support, then that means you're going to have to be a good self advocate and you're going to have to work really hard and expend a lot of energy managing it yourself. And Madeline, on the other hand, she didn't, um, she's, she got to college in her freshman and sophomore year. Freshman year was 2020. So COVID year, which was, kind of a double challenge there, but she found that she had tried it on her own and she finally said, you know what, let me give the medication a trial. And so she, in addition to her anxiety medication, she added an ADHD medication as well and has had wonderful success. She's made Dean's List a couple of times and is doing very well. So two very different children. I love them both dearly. They each have very different personalities. And, one of the things the images that really made an impact on me, Dr. Ekior, was when you presented about ADHD and ADD. It's
Mm,
that image of having a mind, it's like the engine of a Ferrari, but having the brakes of a bicycle
mm,
and kind of a bad bicycle at that, right? And I keep that in mind with both of them when I'm working with them.
mm.
And so I try to give them both grace, but at the same time, respect their humanity by treating them as adults.
Yeah, that quote was from Ed Holloway, that wrote a book and described how he encouraged kids by telling them, that their brains were Ferrari engine and it's just that they have bicycle brakes. So what you need to work on is the brake. That was the light bulb for me, when I read that adequate. Could you elaborate on the struggle of finding a balance? And what were the initial signs or challenges associated with ADHD in your children?
Well, again, we're talking about two very different children. With Mags, I think it was probably a more quote unquote typical path that,
Mm,
at least my experience in working with middle school children, Max was having an extreme, like I said, was having a very challenging time self managing his behaviors. And he was exhibiting very disruptive behaviors in the classrooms. And even though Kelly and I were both keenly aware that our son was very active and a very active young man,
mm,
and we suspected he had ADD and ADHD, we didn't get that confirmed until his seventh grade year because he was having such a hard time. Teachers reported that he couldn't sit down for extended periods of time, that he could not contain his side conversations. It was almost, they could almost see it was an impulse that he had to speak or had to get out of his seat or had to cut up. He has a great sense of humor. So he had a great ability to seek and gain the attention of his peers. And he got a lot of positive response from his peers, negative response from his teachers. And so he started getting into trouble. And teachers and again, we worked with the teachers. We got called in for a parent teacher conference. We went to our pediatrician before that conference and had the teachers do the various scales that they do. And the parents filled one out and Max worked with the school psychologist. Actually, no, with the pediatrician. I take that back in completing that evaluation. And yeah, he ranked as like, yes, off the board ADD, ADHD. At the same time, we're like, so Max, what do you want to do about this? We love you. We want to see you be successful. It sounds like you're a very bright young man. Is it that you're bored? Is it that you're struggling to stay on task? Or are you, or is the behavior that you're exhibiting towards some of your teachers disrespectful? Is that who you are? And he's like, no, I don't want to be disrespectful. I know that I'm seen that way and I don't want to be. So what are we going to do to change that? And so it was a process. And I wish I could say that, Max he ended up graduating from high school on time, but I would say that he has a very high average to high IQ, very capable. This is a young man who built his first computer at age 10 and continues to refine and retool his different computers. He set up a network in his own bedroom once using three or so different computers. So he has that keen ability to zero in on things that he's absolutely interested in, but everything else, meh, could care less. And so for him, it got to the point where we didn't advocate for a 504 plan for him until his sophomore year of high school, because I said, Max, you're going to have to take tests and you're going to have to sit the Regents exams in order to graduate from high school. You're going to have to sit for 2 hours at a time without getting out of your seat. And you're going to have to handwrite everything unless you have accommodations. And he's like, oh, I'm really good at typing and expressing myself that way. But writing, oh no, I'm not going to do well. So that was him telling us that we needed to help him advocate for himself.
mm,
And so the step that his mother and I took was we contacted his school counselor and we put it in writing saying that our son is has a diagnosis from the pediatrician with ADD, ADHD, and we would like him considered for a 504 plan for testing accommodations. We put that in an email, send it to the counselor. The counselor is very responsive, and that triggered a 504 committee meeting, and they evaluated the situation, and he was afforded those accommodations. And those accommodations included extended time, separate location, minimal distractions, and access to a word processor. I absolutely believe that he would not have received his diploma and he would not have graduated from high school on time if he didn't have those accommodations. and he's now gainfully employed, working in a manufacturing job and still figuring out what he wants to do in the world. I think he had a negative experience in high school with education, so he's not sure what he wants to do yet. But he is paying his own rent and he is gainfully employed. So, we're letting him advocate for himself and find his own way in this world. Maddie, on the other hand, really, she was 17 years old and she said, I want to get diagnosed so that I can try ADHD medications. And we let her work with a pediatrician and she got herself diagnosed, got herself on medication. She's a very, I would say, type A personality, very structured, very scheduled. So with Maddie, she's really taken the lead all on her own. And we've been very hands off with her and she's been very successful. So again, two very different presentations of ADHD and two very different children with personalities to match.
Yeah, Dr. Steve, some listeners may wonder how easy it was for your family to advocate for your children in school and the community. Was understanding and support readily available, or was it a struggle? Could you share that process with us?
So, it's kind of how do I put it? Because this was where the district there I was quote unquote born in, I was very well known and very well connected. So I had the privilege of those connections with my peers. I never abused them, don't get me wrong, but I have a lot of friends in the Webster Central School District, and I would like to think that because they knew me as the kind of person that would never cry wolf, so to speak. And what I mean by that is I've experienced cases where, you know, there's a student who there have been cases where, a student's in trouble, in trouble, in trouble, in trouble, and repeat behavior issue. And maybe it's not. It usually, in some cases, it is absolutely is ADD, ADHD. There are some cases where it's clearly not, and there are other things going on. That's what I mean by crying wolf. So it's blaming a condition rather than trying to come up with a solution. And so, because I came from a place of I want to work with you to work with my child in finding success, I think that was helpful. I think the fact that I knew people, but also, 20 plus years in the system, I knew the system. It was helpful for me to know what the New York State regulations were. I don't think every parent, I know for a fact that even when I was just quote unquote only a classroom teacher, I definitely didn't know the whole process for how to get labeled. It was only after I had been an administrator and had run CSE meetings, committees on special education and 504 committee meetings that I really knew what was that procedure. So for me, because I was a part of the system, I'd say it was fairly easy. At the same time, I've talked to many parents as an educator, as an educational leader that didn't know what the system was. So when I worked in one school is in the alternative education program, one of the things I always did with my parents is say, this is the system we have. These are the kinds of supports we have in place. And what is it that you'd like to explore? You let us know and we'll help you navigate the system. I was lucky enough to be a part of that system. That was an important part of my job as an educator. I took pride in making sure that I worked alongside my staff to educate our parents and help them become good advocates. And we would support them in helping them navigate the system. I don't know that every school in every district does that. My hope is that, in 2024, 50 years after the initial federal law that guaranteed equal opportunities in education, that we'd be in a much better place in America. But, I'd say that anecdotally, there are some districts and some schools do a wonderful job, and then there are others that have some work to do.
What advice or resources would you recommend to parents who are seeking support for their children with ADHD but aren't sure where to find help?
I think the first line of support are the overworked and underpaid mental health support staff at our schools. First and foremost, your school social workers, school counselors, and school psychologists are have a wealth of information about what are the best supports available, or what are the most appropriate supports? Because one of the things that I've also seen as an educator and as a parent is this idea of, how do we put it? We smother our students with supports, and so by giving them by giving them some students so many supports, it actually ends up robbing them from a full access to an educational system. So that's why I say, you know, talk with your child's student counselor or school counselor, talk with their school psychologist, talk with the social worker, one of the three. You don't have to do all three, one of the three. And if they don't know who who it is or what they should do, ask them to connect you with somebody who does. They should all everyone should every all of the mental health providers in those titles that I mentioned should know, but if they don't know, then it's absolutely appropriate to talk to an assistant principal, a principal, or calling the school district coordinator for special education, or if you ask to speak to the person in charge of student support services or special education for the district, every public school district in New York State is required to have somebody that is in charge, whatever their title is, of special education for their district. And uh, they are also required to respond to parents in a timely fashion. If they're not, there are other resources you can seek. I'm grateful for the fact that I have worked in all the districts that I've worked in, the Rochester City School District included, have been very responsive to parents and student needs, and do respond to parents in a very timely fashion. There are organizations, however, they're called parent and student advocates for special education. I'm sorry that I know that there are several in the area. There's actually a coalition of parents, and every district actually has to have a parent rep on every committee for special education. So as a parent, you can ask for, who is your parent rep? Because there's a lot of power in speaking peer to peer, parent to parent, and the parent representatives on committees for special education are usually parents or adults that have had their own children with special needs, or they themselves were students with special needs at one time. So I would encourage them to pursue and advocate for themselves and their family in those ways.
Hmm. Now let's move and have you put your educator's hat, because I know there are teachers out there, there are administrators out there that are wondering, okay, yeah, um, how do we fit into this discussion? How do we benefit from this? How would you want to explain to that population on how they can create from your own experience as an educator an inclusive environment for students with ADHD and their peers?
Yeah, I'm thinking, I'm putting on my hat as a former assistant principal in an alternative education school within a school.
Mm.
Putting on my hat as an assistant principal in a larger setting. Um, and also now back in the classroom after 20 plus years out and back in and teaching in an urban environment. And if I think of one thing that is the most helpful and most important when we talk about inclusivity and making our classrooms a welcoming and inclusive environment, it's thinking is recognizing each student for who they are. I think that labels are helpful in helping us understand conditions and behaviors that students might be presenting with, but you you can't one cannot. I in the past has said, oh, that kid has ADHD. Oh, they're going to be a pain in the tuchus all year long. Da 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 da. No, 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 no. I have found since that when I get to know a young adult and I value their humanity and say, all right, this student really struggles to sit in their seat for extended periods of time. I need to make sure that I give them an opportunity to get up and get out of their seat every 5 to 10 minutes. And, other students might not be able to handle that distraction. So how do I position the other students in the classroom that I know will be distracted by that student getting out of their class, getting out of their seat and wandering? How do I meet the needs of all kids in the classroom? How do I meet the needs of all learners so that they can all find success? That's a balancing act. And I think it's that idea of being flexible and being patient and well rested. I say that as we're entering secondary testing at the middle school level for ELA and mathematics right now. It's being flexible, but at the same time having standards for student behavior. And so it's that idea of knowing each child and knowing all of your children, and at the same time advocating for each individual, but making sure that one individual doesn't disrupt the learning process for the whole classroom. It is constantly a balance, and I find myself feeling that tug of war on a daily basis because I absolutely want that one student that needs a lot of attention, and in some of my classes it's 10 out of the 28 that need all of that. And then, but at the same time, there are others that yes, we need to continue instruction. So I guess balance, flexibility, and giving yourself and them grace. And when you're having a bad day, take a deep breath and you just take the break.
Did you find ADHD specific training as an educator, or did your personal experience with ADHD in your family lead you to seek out information on managing the condition?
A specific course that said, here's how you meet the needs of a child with ADD, ADHD. I did take a broader course, multiple professional learning opportunities that looked at how do you take into account the social emotional needs of each learner in addition to their academic needs and providing those supports. And included in that was how do you support students with ADD and ADHD? Here's what it might look like in your classroom. Here are things that you might think that are presenting one way, and you might be interpreting them as disrespect or simply being a disruptive, quote unquote, naughty student, but are really signs of ADHD. There's a good person inside there. And I am always careful to hang on that hope. So again, I think that as a system, we would do better to really, because ADD and ADHD is so prevalent in our schools, that diagnosis of other health impaired is so prevalent, we would do well to take a look at, all right, here's the basics of ADD and ADHD. This is what it looks like. This is how it might present itself. And here's what you can do as an educator. And when in doubt, ask for help. Put your head together with your teammates, with all the other educators that are working with this child, and try to come up with systems that work for this student to be successful and also support all of the students in the classroom in finding success.
Thank you, Dr. Lysenko, for generously sharing your experiences. Your dedication to raising awareness and supporting children in diverse environments is highly commendable. I'm sure many of our listeners have gained valuable insights from your perspective. We appreciate your time and willingness to participate in this discussion.
And thank you for your kind words. And it was a pleasure to offer my insights for what they're worth. And I hope people found them helpful. And thank you, Dr. Ekior, for taking on this very important topic and condition that is so prevalent in our schools, and for your commitment to supporting all children in finding success in our schools. Thank you.
Thank you. As we wrap up today's discussions, we want to extend a special invitation to our valued listeners. Your participation is not just welcome, it's crucial. By subscribing, sharing, and joining our community, you are helping us unravel the complexities of ADHD, weaving understanding and support into every episode. So thank you for tuning in, and we hope to see you in our next episode.